Good morning and welcome to the 16th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Agenda item 1 is Declaration of Interests. As members will be aware, Liam Kerr is no longer a member of the committee. I'd like to pay tribute to his contribution to the work of the committee over the last few years and wish him well in his new role. We therefore have a new member to welcome, Graham Simpson, and can I invite Graham to declare any interest relevant to the committee's remit.
No relevant interests. Been
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Agenda item 2 is choice of deputy convener. Liam's departure also means that we need to choose a new deputy convener. The Parliament has agreed that only members of the Scottish Conservative Party are eligible for nomination as deputy convener. I understand that Graham Simpson is the party's nominee for this post and will rise to high office straight away on the committee. I am assuming that all members agree to Mr. Simpson being the new deputy convener unless a member indicates otherwise. Members are agreed and I congratulate Graham on his appointment and welcome him to the committee. Agenda item 3 is decision on taking business in private. Again, I am assuming that everyone agrees unless a member indicates otherwise. But does any member object to taking item 5 in private? Members have agreed to take item 5 in private. Agenda item 4 is the COVID-19 implication for public finances in Scotland on audit. Can I welcome to our meeting the new Auditor General for Scotland, Stephen Boyle. Stephen, this is your first formal meeting with us, so can I formally congratulate you on your appointment and say that the committee looks forward to working with you and your team, and I know at some point in the future we will be having a public session to discuss your own priorities in your new role as Auditor General. Stephen Boyle, the Auditor General, is accompanied by Mark Taylor, Audit Director, Audit Scotland, and Fiona Diggle, Audit Manager at Audit Scotland. Can I invite the Auditor General to make an opening statement?
Many thanks, Convener. Good morning, members. And thank you again, Convener, for your warm words. I'm delighted to join you this morning as the Auditor General for Scotland as my first meeting, and I really look forward to working with the committee over the weeks, months and years ahead. Over a matter of months, Convener, the public health crisis caused by COVID-19 has profoundly affected all aspects of Scottish life. Central to this are the personal tragedies suffered by the thousands of people who have died or lost loved ones. The pandemic is far from over, and it remains unclear what impact it will have on us as individuals, on public services and the economy. The crisis has required the Scottish and UK governments to respond quickly, providing substantial additional funding for individuals, businesses, public services and the economy. In this briefing paper, we set out our initial assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's public finances up to the end of July 2020. We analyse the emerging risks to both the Scottish Government's budget and the performance of public services. We also outline how public audit is responding to these events. The Scottish Government has made over 90 separate spending announcements aimed at tackling the pandemic, totalling some £5.3 billion, likely with more to come. Transparency matters more than ever. I welcome the introduction of a summer budget revision to aid Parliament's ongoing scrutiny. And we similarly welcome the Scottish Government's confirmation in the past few days that the deferred medium-term financial strategy will be published alongside the budget in December of this year. The Scottish Government spending programme is taking place alongside the UK Government's own spending and taxation measures that apply in Scotland. A key task for all involved will be ensuring Scottish Government's responses work well alongside UK Government and local government measures. The pandemic has also brought immediate risks to people, public services and the economy, with some groups in society disproportionately affected. Risks to people's health and well-being will continue over the longer term, and responding to the pandemic will affect the Scottish Government's wider aims and objectives. Public services will need to adapt. For our part, we are currently reviewing our forward work programme to reflect the changing context of COVID-19 and its implications for public finances, public services and outcomes for citizens. This briefing will support that work, and as we look to provide transparency, support parliamentary scrutiny and share good practice and innovation, I will continue to engage with the committee on this. Convener, my colleagues Mark Taylor, Fiona Diggle and myself are delighted to be here to support the committee's consideration of this briefing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Auditor General. Can I put on record my thanks to all the team at Audit Scotland, who I know have continued to work in extremely challenging circumstances, so please pass on our best wishes to all of your colleagues as well, Auditor General. I'm going to open up the questioning on behalf of the committee, and then I'm going to hand over to Colin Beattie. Can I kick off by asking, Auditor General, what is the total spent in Scotland in response to COVID-19? And I mean not just by the Scottish Government, but across both of Scotland's government. What's the total spent in response to COVID-19?
Thank you, Convener. What we look to set out in the paper is really the spend up to the end of July, and we've focused in on a figure of 5.3 billion as being the spend that's been identified as contributions to COVID-related matters. We also touch on the report that there's been a range of other spending announcements that from the UK government and capture aspects of those too. Indeed, Convener, as you know, the equally local government across the country, across Scotland and the UK, are also taking steps to reprioritise. All of that complexity makes it really quite difficult to say with any degree of confidence or accuracy what the total spend has been so far. There's undoubted volatility as well, even to the extent that funding or budget funding measures may not necessarily have been spent to date, and that volatility makes it quite challenging and difficult to pin down the total spend. All we can probably do is continue to track through the year to date, and in anticipation of the year end, what that will be. My team and I, auditors working on behalf, are still auditing all that spend. The challenge is, as ever, Convener, is timing. Much of the spend that will be reported through audits will only have captured a small amount of the figure up to the end of March. Audits that are currently ongoing will capture the spend in detail. A lot of kind of uncertainty, Convener, in my response. What we do have in the paper is really just say that some of the very significant, unprecedented amounts that have come to Scotland so far.
So a rough ballpark figure is around that 5.3 billion that you've quoted in the report. Can I ask about what's the split in that in terms of Barnett consequentials from UK government spending and reallocation from existing Scottish government budgets?
Thank you, Convener. The majority of the additional spending that's come to the Scottish Government has been from Barnett consequentials, and we touch on aspects of that in the paper. The Scottish Government has also taken steps. I think we have referred to a figure of around £855 million that has been reprioritised from within the Scottish Government's own budget as it analysed where pre-COVID anticipated spending patterns would no longer be able to be fulfilled. I'll ask the team to come in a minute. Maybe Fiona is able to kind of give us a little bit more detail around the 855 million and how that's best analysed. What we've effectively seen is that undoubtedly from now, majority of that additional spending has come through from Barnett consequentials, but Fiona can tell us a wee bit more about the spend, how the Scottish Government's money has been allocated.
Hi, yes, absolutely. So in terms of reprioritisation, we know that there were 255 million set out in the summer budget revision, and that was mostly funding that had been redeployed from spending that could no longer be undertaken from COVID, but also where that the Cabinet Secretary mentioned in a letter to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, a further 600 million that could be reprioritised. We don't know much more detail about that at the moment, but we expect to get more information at the autumn budget revision next month.
Thank you. Did you want to come back in there, Auditor General?
No, Convener, I think effectively what we're seeing is just a real degree of uncertainty and volatility in the spending at the moment, but in the round, undoubtedly the vast majority of additional spending that's come through to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government has flown through from the Barnett consequentials of UK government spending choices.
And what do you see as a long-term impact on the Scottish budget of that?
long term, it's hard to give you any degree of confidence or prediction, convener. What we are seeing in the report, though, is that with there's some real spending choices that the Scottish Government will have to make in future, as it looks at its primary requirement to balance its budget on an annual basis, and in doing so, we expect that it will need to continue to really have a close analysis of its spending plans and the continuation of the reprioritisation of its programmes. The committee will be well versed in, and I'll ask Mark Taylor to come in a moment just to expand on this point, if I may, about the financial challenges that existed. Some of that relates back to pre-COVID days, so particularly the implications of forecasting differences between the spending and income of the Scottish Parliament as a result of the new powers. So it was already dealing with some of these challenges that would be affecting future years' budgets. So that's still there, and within the confines of the existing powers, that's going to bring in some additional challenges to balance that budget. Convener, maybe ask Mark just to expand on that point, if you may.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Auditor General. Morning, everyone, and thank you, Auditor General. Just to pick up on the Barnett consequential points, and then maybe touch on some of the broader issues going forward. The Barnett consequentials in this year that have been guaranteed are 6.5 billion. There's a bit of uncertainty still about the makeup of those, and that's important because what the Scottish Government said about health, pass on of the health consequentials, and those are amounts that are guaranteed in the current financial year. What's less clear is how that might affect next year's budget, and of course we'll not know that until we get to the UK budget in the autumn. The Chancellor setting out his overall fiscal policy, what that means for borrowing and what that means for public spending. So as Auditor General says, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about not just how the rest of this year will continue, but how that will flow into next year. The Scottish Government needs to deal with that uncertainty as it moves to its own budget in December, but also needs to take account of the things that were already there, as the Auditor General says, before this year, particularly the expectation that there will be some large tax reconciliations required in the 21-22 budget. We're expecting those currently to be around £550 million, and that would be a reduction in next year's budget. But again, we've got uncertainty over that because those actual amounts won't be known until HMRC is able to publish the outturn for the relevant financial year. So all those things, the management of the reserve, the borrowing that's there, all need to be factored in as the government looks towards next year's budget. But of course, there's a long way to go as it manages through this year as well. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. I see there's a supplementary question from Graham Simpson, so I'm going to go to Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. It's about Barnett consequentials, and I was just wondering if you know whether all the Barnett consequentials that have been announced have been passed on yet, because we had a situation earlier in the year where Barnett consequentials for local government had been announced, but it was some time before that money actually came through, and some of us were calling for the Scottish Government to pass on money that they actually didn't have yet. So I just wondered if you knew that whether all the announcements had come through yet.
Thanks, Mr. Simpson. I'll maybe start that and ask Fiona to come back in a second about just the flow through of funds to the Barnett consequentials. Some of it's more straightforward than others. I think it's our understanding that the NHS Barnett consequentials have largely been passed through directly to the NHS, but from some of the schemes there's a little bit more complexity. And Fiona, can you maybe pick that question up, please?
I think we're not close enough to the detail of how the money is flowing through to the Scottish Government, but one thing I would highlight is of that 6.5 billion in Barnett consequentials that was confirmed in late July, 800 million of that is a guarantee that's not connected to any UK spending as yet. So we don't quite know what the makeup of that will be, which I think is an area where does give some uncertainty for the Scottish Government, even within that guarantee. Thank you, Convener.
General, can you remind us on how many jobs and businesses have been supported by the different packages that have been put in place by both the UK and Scottish governments. How many businesses and jobs in Scotland supported through COVID-19?
I'll do my best, Convener, to try and set out the analysis that we have, and we cover aspects of that in Exhibit 2 to the briefing paper, which kind of sets out the table. And this, we try to put some numbers around that, probably more the kind of the spend and allocated budget as distinct from the number of jobs or businesses themselves that have been supported. There's lots of uncertainty. I think that's coming through in some of our answers this morning, Convener, is that much of it will be a process that will still track through as to how the money's been spent, and that forms part of our work that we'll bring back to the committee. What we're not doing in this briefing paper today is really forming any judgments about how much has been spent quite yet, or indeed what kind of value has been derived from that. In terms of business support through Scottish Government spending, we say that around 3.3 billion has been allocated to support business measures, ranging from the £10,000 small business grant and the £25,000 grant for hospitality and leisure businesses. Later on in the paper, Convener, we try and connect that around paragraphs 36 or so about the impact of the UK government scheme. That number is split between both the self-employed scheme and and those employed workers through the furlough scheme. I would probably need to come back to the committee just and draw maybe some other analysis as to what the ratio of those numbers is to the total number of paid employment posts.
The ratio I'd heard mentioned, quoted before, was 1 in 3 workers in Scotland job is being supported by one scheme or another. Some analysis on that, I think, would be welcome.
It's clearly very significant in terms of the overall percentage of the Scottish workforce.
And final question from me, and then I'm going to hand over to Colin Beattie. Undoubtedly, COVID will have had an impact on so many different parts of the government's programme, whether that is either legislative or actually programme of things that they're trying to do out around the country, and in some of the government's targets in terms of what they want to achieve in different sectors, whether that be in health or it be in infrastructure or be in transport. Will you keep a track, though, of what was genuinely impacted by COVID and therefore delayed or didn't work or failed due to COVID, and those things that were off track or failing anyway or pre-COVID?
It's a really important question, Convener, actually, and it's something that all auditors have been alert to about. The fact is that the Scottish Government and public bodies in Scotland collectively and individually were facing challenges that were in place before COVID. We've touched on aspects of that as it relates to the overall financial position, with the impact of forecasting reconciliations from previous years already having an impact on the overall public finances. But we're also clear that some matters, whether there were individual challenges in some public bodies, also existed. And we're mindful that that COVID can't explain all of that, all of the challenges, as and when circumstances arise. And I should say, Convener, that that through our own reporting back to the committee, we intend just to kind of make that distinction where there are COVID-related matters, and equally to follow through in some of the statutory reporting that my predecessor brought to the committee in previous years, and making sure that that awareness and that transparency still continues through audit work. And then just lastly, Convener, I think it's equally important on public bodies, and particularly the Scottish Government, to have that public reporting about the impact of COVID has had on its plans, and to reinforce the importance of the National Performance Framework and tracking those outcomes and how public money has been spent and what it's achieved across society.
Thank you, Auditor General. I'm now going to hand over to Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. Auditor General, let me add my welcome to your coming to the hot seat, and wish you every success in the years to come. I have a question about budgets here, which is probably not a surprise. The briefing comments on the sheer speed with which the financial changes have had to be made due to COVID-19, and it's been highlighted that the Scottish budget was announced on the 6th of February, but included no reference to the pandemic, whereas the UK budget on the 11th of March included spending of 12 billion on COVID-19. Would you have expected to see any reference to COVID in the Scottish budget in February?
I'm sure in and amongst all of the reviews that will take place, Mr. Beattie, there'll be some assessment about levels of preparedness or awareness and some degree of hindsight. I think I was reading just about kind of the pace of the virus this last week, about when the first cases were identified in Scotland and when the first individual tragedies for some families, of when the first deaths were announced. These events took place in quite a short period between February and into early March. Whether that would have been enough to suggest that there needed to be the fiscal response that we're now seeing through budgets back in February, I'm not sure if that would have been a reasonable position. What I can see, and I think as you touched on, is the pace with which spending changes has happened since the scale of the crisis became clear.
Certainly it would appear that the UK budget was much later than the Scottish budget in terms of timing, so they perhaps would have an indication that there were some problems coming down the line. I mean, 12 billion turned out to be a drop in the ocean compared to what was eventually needed. Just continuing on the same theme, the pandemic has come to a point where the Scottish budget is quite complex. It's volatile and uncertain as a result of new tax, social security and borrowing powers, and it also notes that maintaining a balanced budget will be more difficult than in previous years. Are you able to give any indication of the scale of the impact of the pandemic on the budget in terms of the complexity?
I'll do my best, Mr. Beattie. I think you're right. I think complexity is undoubtedly the best word to describe the circumstances that we're in. I think what we've tried to capture in the briefing paper is the pace of some of the changes that have taken place over recent months. We've mentioned a couple of times already that up until the end of July, there have been 90 separate spending announcements by the Scottish budget, by the Scottish Government. We also touch on the fact that there's been a summer budget revision. I can't recall if we've had one of these. It's been certainly many years, if ever, that there's been a separate summer budget revision which I think illustrates just the sheer scale of complexity and pace. The committee will be aware that budget revisions usually take place in a kind of formal context in autumn and spring. We really welcome the summer budget revision, think that's been an important step, recognising the scale, but also improving the transparency around the budget setting process. And in terms of, as well as the budget in year, Mr. Beattie, if I maybe say, is that touching on, as we capture in the paper too, about the medium-term financial strategy. We think that's also a key component of the budget setting as we look into the future. And that the Scottish Government reasonably took the decision to defer the medium-term financial strategy, which was due for publication right at the outset of the pandemic, and that it's now just within the last few days confirmed that it does plan to republish an updated medium-term financial strategy alongside the draft budget in December. We also think that's a welcome commitment to transparency and best supporting scrutiny in times of complexity.
So basically, at this point, we haven't actually got any idea what the Scottish budget is going to look like on the back of the pandemic and how it's going to impact on so many aspects of it. Back to the word complexity.
So you're right. I think there's a real moment of decision and choice for government as to how it intends to respond to the pandemic, the choices it will make about its priorities and spending, and what outcomes it looks to make for the people of Scotland. And again, just to kind of reiterate, I think those outcomes, recognising that the pandemic hasn't been felt equally across society, feels ever more important. You'll know, Mr. Beattie, and the committee, that my predecessor often made the point that there was not enough connection between what money had been spent and what the associated outcomes had been from public spending. complexity. Sometimes there's a need for simplicity, actually to say what money was spent, what was intended to be achieved from that, and be able to track that through to the outcomes associated with that public spending.
And of course, it's too early at this point, really, to make any sort of assessment on that, isn't it?
Yes, I think in terms of value for money, it's a key part of public audit's responsibilities, and it's something that we will return to through a wide suite of work. I kind of touched on this, that we're in the midst of reviewing our forward work programme, and that will capture, I guess, an interim assessment of how some of that money has been spent. The first output that we'll bring, or not the first rather, so one of the many outputs we'll bring will be the Nhs Overview report in early 2021. We'll just take stock of the impact that COVID has had on the NHS along with the NHS response. And then similarly alongside that will be the Scottish Government Section 22 report, where we'll take stock of building on this paper about how the Scottish Government finances have been impacted and how it has spent its resources. But absolutely, value for money is a key part of our work, but where we're at right now in this process, in the middle of the financial year, is something that we'll return to rather than making any judgments at this stage.
Now, clearly, Auditor General, we're talking about complexities and so on. This has actually added quite a bit of complexity to Audit Scotland's activities. Are you able, from the interest of the committee, are you able to maintain your previous schedule of audits, or are these now going to have to be changed? I won't say compromised, but reprioritised on the back of this. Are we going to see an entirely different programme?
So, Mr. Beattie, you'll know, and I think particularly, through your role as the chair of the Scottish Commission on Public Audit, about the steps, some of the steps that Audit Scotland have taken in response to the pandemic. I'll maybe touch briefly on our performance audit activity. Yes, we decided to pause our performance audit programme, our value for money programme, at the start of the pandemic. That was the right thing to do. Some of the work that we had planned needed to be looked at and think, is that the best public audit response given where we were in the pandemic? We're coming towards the end of reviewing that programme. Both myself, my colleagues in the Accounts Commission who oversee local government audit are due to receive, and are fed into the process, and are due to receive an updated performance audit programme in the next couple of weeks. And we've been engaging with the committee clerks' expectation that we'll bring that to formal consultation to the committee sometime in October. In terms of our financial audit work, our auditors are all auditing remotely, both the auditors who work for Audit Scotland and the firms who we contract with to audit public bodies. Some of those audits have been signed off and completed remotely, ever mindful of the need for maintaining quality standards. But what is happening, Mr. Beattie, is that some of these audits are taking longer than would have been originally expected. So our NHS audits, which would have been due to complete at the end of June, most of those will be done by the end of September, and other central government bodies, which tended to complete really from early summer through to late autumn, are due to complete in a range of timetables through to the end of December. The key document that the committee will be familiar with will be the Scottish Government's Consolidated accounts, which gathers up all of the central government and NHS spending, and that will also be a bit later this year. Usually it was around the end of September. We're hopeful, albeit with some challenges still to overcome, that it will be the end of December, which again is a useful stock take as to how audit has been performing and some of the judgments that you'll want to see that auditors are making across the piece.
I mean, obviously, from the point of view of this committee, we have had expectations as to when follow-up audits and so on will take place, and it will be useful as and when you're able to do so to update us on that so that we can adjust our expectations as well.
Absolutely, I think, and I think it goes back in part to some of the conveners' questions, is that some matters are COVID related and some won't be, and I think it's important that where the committee has had a strong interest in a particular body and subject, is that through our own public reporting is that we're able just to support and help track that improvement process through those public bodies, and we're very clear in that, and we'll capture that in the programme of work that we'll bring back to the committee.
Thank you, Auditor General.
Thank you, Mr. Beattie. I will now go to Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Stephen, and welcome to the committee. I wonder, could you just give us a little flavour the international aspect to this and what borrowing is looking like internationally to get respective countries through this crisis, and whether we think it's enough? Because I'm sure members in the committee would agree with me. I've got a number of businesses in my constituency that have closed during the lockdown and they aren't reopening. They're not reopening because of the situation. So the question has to be asked, is the government's borrowing enough money to get us through this particular crisis? I know the European Union's borrowing 750 billion euros, and I know that New Zealand is borrowing 50 billion New Zealand dollars. So where do we sit in the context of that kind of amount of international borrowing, and really is it enough?
Thank you, Mr. Coffey, actually, and I appreciate your welcome. I think actually maybe I'm going to ask Mark Taylor to come in a moment. Mark has kind of led in a lot of our work around borrowing arrangements. I can update the committee on where the Scottish Government borrowing powers to date and plans have progressed, and maybe touch on aspects of UK Government borrowing. I would maybe, before I do that, Convener, actually, I think it's maybe worth saying about just the relative powers and the scale of borrowing, the powers that exist with the Scottish Government relative to the UK Government. I think it's really it's not a role for me to say about whether the Scottish Government has or hasn't powers in the right place as it relates to the fiscal framework and the powers that exist within it. We know, as the committee does, that conversations and requests have been made by the Scottish Government to the UK Government for an extension of those arrangements in light of COVID. As far as I'm concerned, I think that's a matter for the governments to resolve, and for public audit to take a view and respond to thereafter, depending on how those powers evolve. Convener, I think I'm maybe going to hand over to Mark for a moment or two, just to kind of touch on the specifics of the borrowing powers and where that relates to for Scotland.
Thank you, Auditor General.
Mark Taylor.
Thank you, Convener. Just a reflection on the overall level of borrowing at the UK level. Of course, there's been figures this week about that reaching record levels, and really over the piece, the UK government and governments across the world having significant levels of borrowing, indeed well in excess of the levels that were present during the 2008 crisis, and it's been a tool in the box of governments around the world to do that, and that flows through ultimately to the Barnett consequentials, Convener, that we talked about earlier, the 6.5 billion, and the UK government's judgments around that fiscal policy are a key influence on the UK on the Scottish budget in turn. As Auditor General says, that's not our remit, that's not our role. We're not around those things. What we are around is around the Scottish Government's borrowing powers and the extent to which it's able to use and deploy those. And what we've highlighted in the paper is that there's a significant amount of commitment of those powers already taking place, which gives limited flexibility looking forward. The challenge for the Scottish Government to manage with all the complexity that Colin Peaty was talking about earlier is to make sure that all those moving parts come together in a way that allows it to manage a balanced budget. That's a significant challenge, and in our paper we set out the risks around that and the challenge and the difficulty around that. As Auditor General says, that's something we'll be keeping a close eye on through our audit work, and we'll continue to report in the committee about how that's been managed. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Mike. Willie Coffey.
Well, thanks, Susanus. I mean, on the flip side of that, we can see even from your report that one of the business grants has meant I think it's about £54 million hasn't been taken up in money that was available to local businesses in Scotland. That's quite a surprise to me to read that. Have you any idea why that take up in that particular example has been so low? Because I'm sure other members would agree with me. They've got local businesses that are still crying out for financial help and assistance, so it's a surprise to hear that there's money being made available in a particular funding stream that's not been taken up in full.
Auditor General.
Thanks, Mr. Coffey. Thanks, Convener. Yeah, you're right. I think we similarly just paused on some of those numbers as to why some of the grants hadn't been taken up yet. And I think we reached a position, Mr. Coffey, that it's a timing difference. I think we recognise in this paper that it is only a snapshot at the end of July. And in some ways, the agility and the pace of which money was being passed out at the height of the crisis was absolutely the priority to support individuals, businesses and public services. On the flip side of that, I think we were also conscious that that wasn't an encouragement for the necessary, not overkill extent of checks and balances to take place alongside just making sure that money was going to the right places. It's not something I can maybe give you the level of detail or assurance that I think you're looking for about what the individual circumstances are at this stage. It is our sense, I think, when we touch on it in one or two places in the paper, a sense of timing difference, but also even on a broader point about why hasn't all the budget been spent that's been allocated. And we expect that the vast majority of it will be, but even some of the programmes that have been identified or introduced in light of COVID will span over more than one financial year. So there's inevitability about not all of the budget will have been spent entirely as had been anticipated as we progress over the course of the year.
Okay. Last query from me, Convener. Stephen, your brief also tells us that there are immediate risks to people and public services and the economy with some disproportionate effects there. You mentioned that in your opening remarks too, and the government will need to consider what financial measures should be implemented in response to changing circumstances. So do you think are there particular sectorial groups that are struggling more than others? Is it the groups that are not yet allowed to come out of the lockdown, and will that support, do you anticipate, be needed over a longer period of time to assist those particular groups at risk?
Yeah, I think we would all recognise that the pandemic hasn't been equally felt, Mr. Coffey. Whether it's the disproportionate impact and the tragedy in some of our care homes and our older people, and how that's been felt, through to the disproportionate number of deaths in our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, and then similarly how it's been felt by our younger people through school closures over the height of the pandemic. And we see that, I think, through some of the statistics, but also at the point you make about what that means for public spending as well, and the choices that governments across the world, really, and closer to home, the Scottish Government will have to make about how it plans to renew and rebuild public services, that the spending choices that it makes, and clearly a question for government and for Parliament to decide as to, of those where the pandemic has been disproportionately effective for some groups, how it then chooses to respond to that, what outcomes it expects to achieve for public money. And to repeat the point, that our sense of the national performance framework provides that route map about if these are the outcomes that government looks to, aims to achieve for citizens, how public spending aligns with that, and to have that the clear connection between spending and outcomes.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Stephen. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Mr. Coffey. Just a quick supplementary from me on Mr. Coffey's question about borrowing, and then I see there's a supplementary question request from Neil Bibby, so I'll go to him in a moment. How does the borrowing through this pandemic compare to the borrowing in response to the economic crash?
Thanks, Convener. I'll do my best to kick that off, actually, and I might invite Mark Taylor in again just to support my answer. It's perhaps maybe my insight's maybe not as close to the borrowing numbers, and again, it's perhaps something we can offer to come back to the committee with a bit more analysis that we haven't touched on in this paper. I think we've seen, I suppose, in some of the scale of the impact of GDP over the height of the pandemic relative to the financial crisis, and the dip being considerably greater than it was during the pandemic. As it relates to UK borrowing, Mark will be able to give us a better flavour of the relativity of the responses between the economic crash and the pandemic.
Mark Taylor.
Thanks, Convener. Thanks, Auditor General. We can come back to you with the specific figures. Bank of England's published data in the last couple of weeks, for example. We can come back to the specifics of that. The overall sense of it, as the Auditor General says, is that the economic effects are greater and the borrowing requirement is greater, and the response is greater around that. There's been an announcement this week of the overall borrowing levels being at record highs, higher than it's previously been, including the 2008 crash. We can come back in detail of that. Just a wee word about the Scottish Government's borrowing. So because borrowing accumulates since the introduction of new powers, inevitably that's building up through time, and the Scottish Government's taken advantage of the borrowing powers that it has. It's difficult to relate that directly to COVID. I think the plans are already in place to make use of some of those powers and build in a balance of that in time. But if we're able to come back to you on the specifics of the UK borrowing figures, we can do that.
Thanks, Mark Taylor and Auditor. I think that would be appreciated, because I think there is a point you made is, of course, the pandemic has had a health outcome, but it's also going to have a livelihoods outcome. I think getting an understanding of a much greater reduction in our GDP, much greater levels of borrowing, potentially much higher levels of unemployment and job losses and business closures in response to the pandemic than the economic crisis, can help put the sharp focus, the deep impact of the hole we find ourselves in, and how we have a collective responsibility to try and get ourselves out of it. So that would be very, very helpful. Auditor General Mark Taylor, if you can provide that information. I'm now going to go to Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Auditor General. Just to follow on from Willie Coffey's question about the disproportionate impact of the virus. Clearly, COVID has not affected us all equally, and that COVID has affected different parts of Scotland in different ways. It's also clear that higher areas of COVID deaths and infections have resulted in greater pressure on local authority spending and services. Sadly, according to the last NRS stats, Inverclyde in my own region has the highest COVID death rate in Scotland. Western Bartonshire is second, Eastern Bartonshire is fourth, Renfrewshire's fifth, and East Renfrewshire is seventh. You mentioned earlier, Auditor General, about money going to the right places. I believe that the worst affected areas should receive additional resources for the reasons given beforehand. Are you able to say if, when allocating extra resources to councils, the Scottish Government has recognised this and compensated the hardest hit areas? Did the hardest hit areas receive the highest additional support per capita from the Scottish Government, and if so, by how much?
Auditor General.
Morning, Mr. Bibby. Thank you for your question. I'm not yet in a position to give you the kind of detail I think you're looking for in terms of the spending choices that the government has made, and indeed probably not yet decided about its own financial allocation model for spending in local authorities. There is a fairly well-established model in place already for how council budgets are allocated as it relates to the grant that they receive from the Scottish Government. Whether government chooses to modify that model in light of COVID-related impact in different local authorities ultimately will be a choice that government will look to make in consultation with its partners in COSLA. But at the moment, it's something I think it's a question that perhaps government will be better able to say its planned way forward on that.
Did you want to come back in just now, Mr. Bibby, or hand over to Graham?
Thank the Auditor General for the answer.
Did you want to come back in, Mr. Bibby, or shall I hand over to Graham Simpson?
Happy to hand over to Graham Simpson.
Excellent. Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. And can I also welcome you to your new post, Stephen? I just want to follow up just on the question that Willie Coffey asked about business grants and the lower than expected take-up. In your report, you say that there's been a lower than expected take-up for some business grants. You don't say what they are. I wonder if you can give us more detail of that. There's a gap of 54 million which hasn't been claimed. My understanding is that the Scottish Government brought forward the deadline for claiming some of these grants. I wonder if you can comment on that. That may explain why there's not been such a great take-up as has been expected. And can you say, if you know, how that money is going to be allocated?
I'll do my best, Mr. Simpson, on that point actually, and I might ask Fiona Diggle to come in and to support. I think, other than say that I think if we capture in the briefing paper, it's really just a sense of this is look to be a snapshot of the allocation of budget and spending up to the end of July. It is undoubtedly an evolving picture, and whether I think as a degree of suggestion, I think in my earlier answer to Mr. Coffey about the need for some degree of process around the grant giving arrangements, recognising also that speed is essential in just how acute some of the circumstances are for Scotland's businesses. But that would be kind of speculation from us at this stage. Fiona, are you able to expand on that at all?
Thank you, Auditor General. Yes, I can say a little bit more about where the reduced take-up has been. We know there's been, for example, only 11.2 million uptake of the newly self-employed hardship fund, which had an original budget of 34 million. But on the flip side, the Pivotal Enterprise Resilience Fund, it was 120 million, had funding topped up, I think at least twice. So it just shows that it's trying to target that money at different places, and it's trying to determine the need at speed. So I think those figures vary, but we should get some more information in the future. And I know that some of the funds are closed, but other ones, for example, the newly self-employed hardship fund, is still open. So it's definitely very much a changing picture. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I wonder if, as details emerge, if you could just keep the committee informed, that would be useful. So sticking to the report, on page 9, you say that at the end of July, and I'm quoting from the report, comprehensive information on the amounts paid out to third parties by public bodies was not available to us. Can you say what you mean by comprehensive information and not available to us? Because presumably the information exists somewhere.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right. In paragraph 21, we make that observation about how the spending has been broken down across different organisations and different bodies. I think what would maybe draw a distinction is say it's not that to say that we think it doesn't exist or couldn't be collated, but rather at the time that we completed this briefing paper, and I should say I think our audit response in the round would normally be quite a considered an audit report that would take us many months to collate. I think equally recognising that our audit response needed to be as flexible as some of the spending that's taken place. So in this briefing paper, we don't go as far as we would normally do in the range of sources and evidence, but we felt it's important to make a contribution to the understanding of how public money's been spent, recognising all the change in volatility. We do expect to get that level of analysis in due course, Mr. Simpson, and capture it in future public reporting and back to the committee.
Okay, that's fair enough. I get that. So on page 10, I'll just refer to the pages to make it easy for you. You comment, I think Fiona mentioned this earlier actually, the UK government's confirmed a further 1.9 billion of funding. This includes an additional 800 million, which isn't attached to any specific spending announcement. So that's the first time that the UK government has provided guarantees of block grant levels in advance of spending commitments being made. And you know it's unclear how this guarantee will align with eventual Barnett consequentials. Can you expand on that point?
So I think that the reason we sought to include this actually, I suppose, was an illustrative example of the pace and somewhat unusual patterns that we're seeing relative to how some of the block grant and funding announcements and the flow of funds have typically taken place between UK government and Scottish government through Barnett consequentials. The purpose of this example really is just to illustrate that point, that some of the typical process and procedures have, in my view, rightly been set aside as a means of getting money out to individuals, public services, businesses at a pace that is necessary to support the response to the pandemic. We don't think it will always be unclear, Mr. Simpson. I think it's probably illustrative of the fact that the Scottish Government already has made its 90 spending commitments of its own. We've had a summer budget revision. We're due to get an autumn budget revision along with the UK government's own spending review, and it's that sense of pace of change and processes that we're in, all of which are right, all of which bring additional transparency, but at different steps in the process. So again, for us, this is really just a snapshot illustration, but one that we expect that there'll be additional clarity, and most importantly, the fact that we know that officials between the Scottish Government and UK Government are in regular communication about the Barnett consequentials. So the clarity will be, if it wasn't available at the time of publication of our report, we expect it now will be.
So just to be clear, I know it seems a bit unclear, but if we can be clear in our head what's going on here, we've got 800 million. So the UK government said you're going to get 800 million at the moment. That's not allocated to anything specific. You're saying we will get that detail at some point.
That's my understanding, yes, and I think, and certainly it is the pace and scale of change. So, as officials in the UK and Scottish governments discuss progress of Barnett consequentials, the Scottish government is able to anticipate Barnett consequentials sometimes in advance, sometimes prior to UK government spending announcements. And I think it's really just the volatility, complexity of the circumstances that we're in captures some of that. That we're talking about such large numbers probably kind of meant that we thought it was necessary to shine a light on some of that pace. But undoubtedly, we expect that clarity to be, if not available currently, to be here with us very shortly.
Okay, thank you. I've just got a couple of other questions. Page 11 of the report, you talk about, and this is in paragraph 28, and it relates to loans. So money's been transferred from energy efficiency loans to fund emergency loans for house builders. That was 100 million. And private sector landlords, that was 5 million. Do we know what the take-up of those has been? Because my understanding is that the fund for private sector landlords, the take-up's not been anywhere near 5 million. Do you have those figures?
I'll ask the team to come in a second, Mr. Simpson, just to see if we have any more detail on that. We have the analysis of the £255 million apologies, reprioritisation. We understand that the Cabinet Secretary has written to the committee over the last few days just to provide a bit more breakdown of that number. I'm not sure we're yet in a position to say what the uptake or what the spending against those budget heads have been, but I'll just check with the team whether they're able to give us any more detail.
Hi, unfortunately we haven't got any more information to share with you on that at the moment. Thank you.
Will you be able to?
I think yes, we will. It's something we'll be continuing to track through our audit work at the moment, actually, and we'll, if we're able to come back to the committee, we will. I think it's equally perhaps a line of questioning that the committee may wish to explore with the Scottish Government, if its own analysis of how monies have been spent and their own assessment of the relative uptake of these new budget heads.
Right. Okay, thank you. My final question, and this is on page 17, paragraph 52, and it's about infrastructure spending, and you refer to delays in some infrastructure spending. Have you got any more details of that, of what schemes have been delayed?
Again, I'll ask Fiona to come back in and see if can give some specific examples. I think if we're also drawing on, I think, delays in infrastructure spending from public sector context, but equally, if I recall back at the height of the pandemic and the requirement for social distancing, you see the number of house building schemes and commercial infrastructure that was paused due to social distancing requirements. I think there's an inevitability about the fact that there will just be some planned infrastructure won't have progressed at the pace that it was able to. And equally, haven't seen, I think, some of the planned infrastructure that was around some of the school building and additional childcare early years provision that was required has also been impacted by that. So Fiona maybe can offer some specific examples over and above those.
Thank you. I don't think we can point to any specific examples of infrastructure projects that have been delayed, but just to highlight that when the Cabinet Secretary did identify 600 million that could be reprioritised, I think 450 of that was for capital, just to highlight the sort of scale of projects that, the scale of funding that has been delayed, and to re-emphasise the Auditor General's point there. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. I'll now go to Bill Bowman.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I can't see if my microphone's working. Can you hear me?
It is working, Mr Bowman. Please continue.
Thank you very much. And it's good to see you, Stephen, here in this role. Now, I want to build a little bit on one of Colin Beattie's points and talk about the impact of COVID on your work. Now, most of the reports we've had in the committee from the Auditor General tend to be historic in nature, and either from the financial audit or work you've done in the past. And when we look at them, we will try and deal with them, but quite often the resolution may lie in the future when you're next to an audit or you're next to one of your sort of cyclical reports. But in a pandemic, information is coming at us monthly, weekly, sometimes even daily, and key decisions are being taken on this. So the Scottish Government may have quality controls over what they say and the information they issue, but can Audit Scotland be involved more real time to give us some independent comfort on the information that's coming out?
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. It's a really interesting question, actually, about where the role of audit is positioned alongside spending choices and decisions that public bodies, that the Scottish Government is taking. And I think the answer is up to a point. So you in the committee will be aware that one of my responsibilities is, in addition to being Auditor General, is the comptroller function, and is to oversee and to sign off the Scottish Government's requested drawdowns of its finances from the Scottish Consolidated Fund. So that is a kind of overarching check that the spending in the totality of the Scottish Government is consistent with the amounts approved by Parliament for the overall budget. As it relates to the more granular level, it's not really a role for, I guess, for auditors to approve spending on individual choices for government. And you're right that historically audit has been positioned about it would come in a number of months, years after the event and express judgments about how well money has been spent, the value for money that's been achieved from it. There's still a place for that, but what we've tried to do in Audit Scotland in our response to the pandemic is to think about the agility of public audit to respond and support in both value for money, but also where improvement is required. Auditors across Scotland are doing just that, because I think it touched on earlier in the conversation this morning that as it relates entirely to financial years, the 1920 audits, most of which are in the process of happening at the moment, some already concluded, only captured 1 month or a number of weeks really in March of COVID-related activity or spend. So in essence, in theory, we could have had to wait till well into 2021 before auditors were expressing judgments about what COVID had meant for public bodies. We're not seeing that. We're seeing already through audit reports that auditors are making assessments, making judgments about public bodies' response to the pandemic in the months since March up to the present day. And it's that sense of, I think, where the audit value has responded to say, both through audit reporting and judgments, about the impact that COVID is having on public bodies. It's a varied approach, I would say, and I think that lastly, through we touched on earlier, the performance audit programme being paused and a revised programme to be published in the next month or so. And in that programme, what I want to do is to say, well, where is public audit now focusing? Some of the work that we previously planned, we've said we've taken a view on that may or may not be necessary, whether we need to refine the scope, and equally bringing in some new areas of activity that respond to the pandemic as well. So I think it's a very considered, measured approach that we look to take, and I've seen that through the work that auditors are undertaking.
Well, let me ask you another question, just a final question. I mean, we know information has a time value, and if you're a government in a pandemic situation, what do you think are the key measures, the key performance indicators that you would look at to see how well you've dealt with it?
I'm sure that'll be a line of question you'll want to explore with government as well, Mr. Bowman, actually, about the specifics that government have taken around KPIs. We know that all public bodies have taken many decisions, both around the decision-making process, the governance around that, and we've highlighted that yes, there's a need for money to be spent quickly, but not at all costs. There still needs to be the right level of internal control, governance, record keeping that takes place during a pandemic. In terms of key performance indicators, I think it depends on what's being spent, in truth. And again, I think we continue coming back to the importance of outcomes and what the pandemic has meant. So we've touched on already the disproportionate nature of the pandemic and how that's been felt, and that these spending commitments that governments across the UK, across the world are making, and for them to have a feel as to the impact that the monies have had. Beyond that, it's probably difficult for me to speculate or be specific about individual KPIs and how public bodies would want to respond to that. What is clear, and the basis of your question is absolutely right, that there does need to be an assessment of all public bodies to have a proper understanding of the impact of how public money has been spent.
Thank you. I can't tease something out of you. I suppose saving lives should be in there somewhere. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman, and I'll now go to Alec Neil.
Thank you, Convener, and again, best wishes, Stephen, for the job. It's nice to see you taking over. Can I start right at the beginning? In fact, before the beginning, there was a report, partly, I haven't seen it, I don't think there was a report produced, both one for the Scottish Government and one for the UK Government, about 4 years ago, and it was a plan for dealing with a pandemic. Can I ask, have you seen that report? And if you have, did it include the plans for dealing with the financial emergency that a pandemic creates?
So I can answer that question quite straightforwardly, Mr. Neil. First of all, thank you for your good wishes, and it's good to see you too. No, I haven't seen that report. I think, like maybe any others, I've heard that of the existence of such plans and preparations that took place around pandemics. And I think my colleagues, I think as part of our work on the Nhs Overview report, are in discussion with the Scottish Government Health and Care Department to form an assessment of just about the preparations that took place. I think it's our understanding, but again, it's something that we'll come back once we've completed our audit work, is that many of the preparations and activity pre-COVID in terms of a pandemic or national emergency were designed around what the impact of a flu pandemic might look like. The detail of that and whether that's an appropriate comparison to how COVID has turned out, we're not yet sure, and I think it's a judgment that us and others will form, and no doubt with many of the reviews that take place. The second part of your question as to whether any of those plans contained sufficient detail as to what the financial response would be to a pandemic and crisis of this scale. I don't yet have that detail, and it's something that we're continuing to follow up as we progress our work.
Can I say, I think there's a difference between the normal planning for contingencies that the Health Service does, which I know as a former Health Secretary is done on a constant basis, and these specific reports I'm referring to. In my understanding, these were cross-government reports looking at the implications of a pandemic on a multidisciplinary basis, not just about the preparations on the public health side. So can I make a suggestion that you actually get a copy of that report and see if it does cover the financial planning? Because for two reasons. Number one, if it does cover the financial planning, then you've got a benchmark against which to measure performance. Were the recommendations of that report appropriate? Were they sufficiently robust? If they didn't cover finances, then clearly I would have thought there's a lesson in there that we, number one, need these pandemic preparation reports much more regularly. We need them robustly. They need to be ready off the shelf when we hit a pandemic, and they need to cover the financial contingencies as well as the public health and educational and all the other contingencies that we've seen have been needed during the pandemic.
Grateful for that, Mr. Neil, actually, and it's certainly something that you're quite right. The pandemic and any preparations for a pandemic ought not just to be the public health implications around it, and cover much more widely about how public services, how the economy, how the fiscal response to that is set out in the round. Preparedness for the pandemic is clearly something that us and others will have a very strong interest as and when the appropriate time for that to make an assessment about any lessons that are needed to be learnt arising from the pandemic and how best to prepare the country for such responses again. If I may touch on one aspect of that in terms of financial planning that you touched on, I think it goes back to some of the earlier conversation today about the medium-term financial strategy and it too having a key place alongside the shorter-term budgets to get that sense of within the medium-term financial strategy that there are sufficient and extensive scenario and sensitivity plans. Whether that goes to another COVID-related event or not will be a choice for government to make, but there are those plans that can be pulled down as and when required. And I guess the presence therein of a medium-term financial strategy that allows government and supports responses, whether it's a pandemic event or otherwise, I think has been shone a light on just how crucial these sorts of transparency and forward planning documents are.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly as a number of organisations, internationally renowned organisations, are predicting that we're likely to see more pandemics more often. I mean, it's basically 100 years since we had anything in this scale, and some are predicting we'll have the next one within 20 years. So it seems to me we've got to be permanently on our guard and well prepared. Can I move on to the funding of the pandemic programme, Stephen? There are essentially three streams of funding. One are the Scottish Government's own resources, which they're maxing out as best they can to deal with the pandemic. Secondly, there are the Barnett consequentials. Thirdly is the borrowing capacity and powers of the Scottish Government. So I've really got two questions here, and I know we've covered borrowing earlier in the conversation, but number one, the current capacity that is left in terms of the borrowing powers of the Scottish Government, are they sufficient to deal with the challenges of the pandemic without forcing massive public spending cuts in other parts of the budget in future years? And secondly, at the moment, the Scottish Government cannot borrow directly from the Bank of England, unlike the UK Government. Now, if you profile the money the UK government borrowed from the Bank of England to deal with the previous crash and the likely deal on the massive amount of money being borrowed for the pandemic, there is to be no interest paid in that money between the UK government and the Bank of England, because it's essentially the government's money anyway. And secondly, there is no repayment schedule. It could take 300 years to repay. It can be written off by the UK government even. They have the power to do that. Whereas the Scottish Government, if we do need to borrow more, and if we're given the power to borrow more than is currently allowed, if we don't borrow from the Bank of England, even though it's low interest rates, we're still going to be paying massive amount of money over the next 20, 30, 40 years to repay that money. Should we not be allowed to borrow directly from the Bank of England? Would it not make more financial sense?
I think I'll maybe start by referring back, I think, to kind of one of my earlier responses to Mr. Coffey, Mr. Neil, is that I don't think it's for me to take a view on where the relative powers of the Scottish Parliament relative to that of the UK Parliament. As the powers currently exist, and subject to any change of those arising from conversations between the two governments, I think it's at that point that we're able to assess what impact they might have or otherwise. In terms of the point of your question, though, within the existing powers, the Scottish Government's borrowing arrangements have been used to date, and I'll ask Mark Taylor to come in a moment just to kind of set out in a bit more detail how that's transpired thus far. But they are close to some of the cap on individual years and totality. And in the absence of any kind of additional scope for borrowing powers, if it's the Scottish Government's wish to do so, then to maintain the balanced budget on an annual basis as is its requirement, then that will require some spending choices to be made about the within the confines of its existing arrangements. What we see, and I think you touched on it in your question, is that spending choices relative to borrowing powers is a difficult matter to square. And as it currently relates, we're looking at the Scottish Government being faced with some difficult spending choices as it looks to rebuild and renew the country post-COVID pandemic. I'll go to Mark now, Mr. Neil, just see if you can give us a bit more detail on where we've currently reached with the borrowing powers.
Thank you, Auditor General. Just to refer Mr. Neil to Exhibit 5, which I know you're aware of in the report, which sets out the headroom effectively on the borrowing powers and indeed the reserve powers in the current statute. You say, taking into account decisions that have already been made by the Scottish Government to allocate those powers, there's restricted headroom available, and that needs to be part of the overall package of measures that the government's thinking about as it goes forward. And of course there are restrictions on when those borrowing powers can be used. They can be used for forecast reconciliations, they can be used for cash management, and they can be used in the event of a Scottish specific shock. But those borrowing powers are there to smooth out volatility, not to bring in additional spending power. The system as it is, and as the Auditor General says, we can only comment on the system as it is, provides those the fiscal borrowing powers at a UK government level, which of course flows through the Barnett consequentials, and we've talked about those numbers earlier today. I think one point that I would make is that in the UK government's borrowing, it's reliant on the financial market. So without getting into the intricacies of fiscal and monetary policy, essentially financial markets need to be able to provide cash that the UK government can draw on. At the moment, those rates are very low. And the UK government's able to take advantage of those low rates, but there needs to be a balance between those low rates and what the overall stock of debt, and those are judgments that at the moment the UK government, under the current arrangements, makes judgments around in setting its own fiscal policy, and the downstream consequences of that are what the Scottish Government then manages through the merits of Barnett consequentials and using the borrowing powers that have been agreed through the fiscal framework. Thank you, Convener.
Can I just correct you, Mark? If you look at an analysis of the UK national debt prior to COVID, at the beginning of March, 23% of the debt owed was directly to the Bank of England. They don't rely entirely on the financial markets. And if you look at what the Bank of England has made available since the start of the pandemic, which brings the total amount the UK government owes to the Bank of England directly to £745 billion, then the Bank of England by far is the biggest source of money, not the markets. The Bank of England has been the biggest source of money for the funding of this pandemic. So my question is very relevant. Why on earth are we not allowed to borrow directly from the Bank of England? Now, I know you can't answer that because that's a political question, but the point is, we are being put at a severe disadvantage by not being allowed to do so because the borrowing we do inevitably carries an interest payment with it and fairly strict repayment schedules. So what difference would it make financially to the Scottish Government if we were able to borrow in the same kind of terms that the UK Government borrows from the Bank of England, where it pays zero interest to the Bank of England and can repay it over 1,000 years if it so desires?
Mark Taylor?
So difficult for us to speculate, convener, about how that system might work. I think that's a much broader question. I think the broad point is that in managing the overall economy and the role that the Independent Bank of England has, that those powers, as Mr Neil says, lies with the UK Government at the moment. What the Scottish Government needs to manage currently is the downstream implications of that through the fiscal policy that's chosen and the Barnett consequentials that flow from that.
What, Mark, I'm looking for, and you might not be the right guys to provide it, what I'm looking for is how much money would the Scottish Government save if it was allowed to borrow directly from the Bank of England on the same terms and conditions as the UK Government does?
So
Auditor General, or Mark Taylor.
So as you recognise there, Mr Neil, not really a question for us around the specifics of that. I think what's clear to us is what the Scottish Government manages at the moment is the impact of the fiscal framework arrangements as they currently exist. And I think the main message that we have in today's report is the need for Scottish Government to be able to manage its overall finances in very difficult circumstances within those arrangements.
Can I ask you one question in terms of the headroom in relation to, because the Scottish Government has a rule that no more than 5% in any 1 year of its current revenue can be spent to finance interest payments, etc., on borrowed money. So how much headroom is left on that 5% at the moment for next year, say?
That one from Mark Taylor or the Auditor General? Auditor General, I'll come to you. You get the easy questions, Auditor General.
I'm not sure we know, Mr Neil, the specifics of that to hand. I'll pass over to Mark in a minute as to whether we have the detail that we're able to give you just now. If we don't have it, and if Mark's not able to spoil out, then we can come back to you in writing after the meeting.
Yeah. We agree there are two headrooms to be measured. One is the headroom left on the borrowing powers, and the other one is the headroom left on that 5% rule.
So certainly the focus what we look to do in the paper is just to illustrate the challenge with the headroom that's available on the existing borrowing powers, mindful that some of that is already being covered with previous year's reconciliations, and that's already eating into it. And the key point for us about the scale of challenge and volatility. As it relates to the 5% rule, I think it's something that we would just maybe have just to look and check our detail and come back to the committee on.
That'd be very helpful. And one final question, convener. I can't hear Stephen.
On you go, Mr. Neil. Continue with your question.
My final question is this, and it's at a more kind of project level. I've heard anecdotal evidence, and I do stress this is anecdotal. I have absolutely no evidence that some of the money that's been put out quite rightly very quickly is not, there are some scams going on, and particularly I've heard that about the Resilience Fund. So my question is, whether or not that is true, is the Auditor General going to look specifically at funds like the Resilience Fund to make sure that there have been no scams and no fair or even illegal use of these funds?
Thank you, Mr. Neil. Yeah, thank you for that. I heard your question actually about the risk of fraud and irregularity, I suppose, in the round of some of the COVID-related spending. I think it's no doubt. I think that the risk of fraud has increased during the course of the pandemic. Whether it relates specifically to the additional schemes that have been created and the pace with which that money has been spent has increased the risk. I think we've also a case of the risk increases more generally during the course of the pandemic, that money's been spent quicker, people are working in more pressurised environment, and then of course externally we have, as we've seen a number of points already over the course of the pandemic, that there are those that look to take advantage of the uncertainty that exists, whether it's through phishing, email scams, or other more sophisticated arrangements targeting public bodies and individuals. We're keeping a close eye on how money's been spent. We know that public bodies also have the onus on themselves to, each accountable officer in public bodies has a responsibility to ensure that money's been spent properly and to put the right level of control environment, checks and balances. Risk and audit committees have an important role supporting the governance around some of this spending. You're quite right, though, that as and when we understand where there's been fraud or irregularity, we take a close interest in that, and as necessary, we'll report back to the committee.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Neil. I have one supplementary request from Graham Simpson.
Thanks again, Convener. It's just a request, really. I just wonder if we can, at some point, get figures on social security spending in Scotland in relation to COVID, both UK spending and Scottish spending, because of course we can have our own benefits here. So just wonder when we can get those figures.
Auditor General.
The things that we're continuing to track.
Answer from the beginning again, sorry, Auditor General, we lost you for the first few seconds.
Apologies for that, Convener. Hopefully you can hear me now. I think one of the things we expect to see, paying a close attention to, is the impact that the COVID has had on the social security spend. Less so in terms of our own responsibilities as it relates to DWP expenditure, which is a reserve matter and subject to its own arrangements in terms of audit and reporting. As it relates to Scottish Government and Social Security Scotland, we know that the COVID has had an impact on that, and it's something that we're continuing to audit. The 2019-20 audit, which colleagues Mark Taylor leads, is currently ongoing and will report later in the year. It will only capture a small amount of the COVID-related expenditure. We'll also cover that as we progress over the year ahead as to what impact it's had on Social Security Scotland's figures for 2020-2021. Interim reporting before then won't necessarily be audited, but I think it is an important insight that the committee could get, perhaps directly from the Scottish Government and from Social Security Scotland.
Thank you, Auditor General.
Thank you.
Did you have any other questions?
No, I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Simpson. I don't think there are any other questions from members of the committee, so can I thank the Auditor General, Mark Taylor and Fiona Diggle for their evidence this morning, and I now close the public part of this meeting as we move into private session.